Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. I am very, very excited to introduce my guest this week to you. I have with me Dr. Mekel Harris. She is a Memphis-based licensed psychologist who loves helping other perfectly imperfect folks navigate life's challenges in order to grow in lifestyle, love, leadership, and loyalties to God, self, and others. And I love that bio so much. And I am just so happy to have you with us. And Dr. Mekel is here today, and she is going to share her own grief journey after losing her mom in 2012, and then more recently, her dad in 2020. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Susan. It is always a pleasure to just be able to share and gain insight and learn from others. So I just appreciate the chance to be at your podcast table.
Well, let's you and I jump right in. I have a feeling that we have a lot of things in common because I know one thing is for certain. You both believe in writing through grief and loss. But let's just start with the story of your mom, because when I was reading through your own website and some of the things that you're doing out in the world to help people in their own grief and loss journey, it sounds like the loss of your mother is really what changed the trajectory of your life. So please tell us about your mom. What?
Yeah. So this beautiful creature, Patricia Ann Harris, was just an incredible force. My mom was the product of a hardworking, single-headed household. And so her mom, my grandmother, raised her to be fiercely independent. She definitely was a woman who knew what she wanted, and it was hard for anybody to say no to Pat. So the one thing that I will say about my mom, she not in addition to being a licensed nurse, she was a nursing professor. So I feel like since the very beginning, we were talking about health, life, and death. My mom was very comfortable. She had worked in cancer facilities and just done a lot of healthcare. And so that was a topic that often came up in our household. And it's one of the things that as a kid drove me nuts and drove a little bit of fear into me. But at the end, it made sense. It's almost like she had been preparing our family for this. So leading up to her death, my mom had suffered a series of strokes earlier in 2012. And my mom, being who she was, she bounced back from suffering strokes. She literally drove herself to the ER while experiencing many strokes in the car. But she bounced back from that. And her plan was to fully retire. She had semi retired. And for she, my brother, and I to take a trip to the Bahamas. That was slated to be in December 2012. Well, as time would have it, September of that year, my mom, who loved to talk, she and I would get on these 24-hour marathons. Yes, Susan, I said 24 hours.
You would talk to your mother, you mean, for 24 hours?
Yeah, yeah, she'd call on a Friday night and we would laugh and cry, and she would tell stories about her childhood and things that I was going through, and we'd fall asleep, we'd wake back up, get jump right back into the story, and it literally went on for, up to 24 hours. So this woman who really loved to talk, in September 2012, our phone calls, my conversations with her were met with, babe, I'm really tired. I'm not really up to talking. And that just wasn't my mom. So I knew fundamentally that something was different. I just didn't know how bad it actually was.
I'm sorry, how old was your mom?
63.
Very young, very,
Very
very young.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So she started to sort of shut down a little bit. And then she would share a few physical health symptoms. One of them was that all of her food tasted metallic. And her being a nurse, I really think that my mom knew that this was a little bit more serious than she was letting on. But it ultimately culminated in a phone call that I received in November 2012. My mom was in Texas. I was in Los Angeles, and I could tell by the tone of her voice that something was wrong. And ultimately, she shared that she had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And because she had worked in this cancer facility for a large portion of her career, she knew that stage 4 pancreatic cancer just wasn't the best diagnosis. The survival rate, even now in 2020, is only about 6.5%.
I was going to say it's super low. Okay, so before we jump in though, so did your mother then, did she have like mini strokes prior to learning that she had stage 4 cancer? Was that leading up? And was that as a result somehow from the cancer that was causing these strokes? Do you know?
I think it was unrelated. So my
Okay.
mom experienced these strokes in the spring, so like March through April-ish. And then, she was discharged, was doing well, didn't experience any strokes until she died. So I think that was an unrelated phenomenon.
Okay.
As far as I know, that's not necessarily connected with pancreatic cancer. In my family, there's a long history of heart-related disease and strokes. So I think that was sort of just the genetic part of our family coming out. So, on the day that she shared her cancer diagnosis, I immediately jumped into problem solving, routed her back to the Cancer Institute that she'd worked for years. And at which time I was met with my mom saying, I know this is going to be it. So I don't want to do anything heroic. I want to spend whatever days I have remaining at home with the people and things that I love. And because my mom was not a person who didn't get her way often, we followed that path, and that's what she did. So on December 9th, about a month later, 30 days, she succumbed to her cancer alongside my brother and I.
So her diagnosis was that she survived a month after diagnosis.
She survived 30 days after her diagnosis. Yeah.
God,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. So you can just imagine it was the oddest thing, Susan. My brother and I were working hard to get her home set up and equipment and things. And honestly, the equipment couldn't get there fast enough. By the time it did, she was already rapidly deteriorating due to the disease and its spread. So she fell asleep right alongside my brother and I. And my brother and I kind of joke about this now, but my mom never liked the center of attention, even though she had a powerful presence. So when she walked in, people were magnetized towards her. But she waited until my brother and I, who we had sworn we weren't going to fall asleep that night because my brother is also a nurse. He knew that she was actively dying and he was sharing that with me, but we fell asleep. And lo and behold, right when we fell asleep, for that short window, which was about an hour, our mom passed away. So as not to be the center of attention.
I was just going to say, and yeah, she slipped away when you two were, I find, I mean, this won't mean much to anybody listening, but for me, it's just uncanny. Today is the anniversary of my mother's stroke. My mother passed away a couple of years ago, but she had her stroke on this very day in December.
Mm-hmm.
Massive stroke. It didn't take her life, but it stole a lot from her. So it's just interesting. It's just coming to me that this particular conversation with you is just, yeah.
Yeah.
It's so, and she was very young as well. She was only 66. But I think that with a cancer diagnosis, there are people that have a cancer diagnosis that live years. So to have a cancer diagnosis and also to have a mother that had worked in that field, I mean, just that depth of knowing that your mother knew, right? I know what this is going to look like. And then for it to be so fast, and she was so young, and then she slipped away when it was, when you guys were, I don't know,
tucked away, safe.
tucked away. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And my mom, my parents had divorced in 2006. So my mom was, we had, of course, our entire family, but for the most part, it was my mom, my brother, and I, and like three peas in a pod. And again, we were planning for this trip. And so I think that she always wanted to ensure that my brother Stanley and I were solid, that we were grounded in our faith, and that we were close and connected to each other. And in that moment, I think that she felt that. She sensed that somehow. And like I said, we woke up and she had transitioned, and it was beautiful and brutal. That was sort of the beginning of a really traumatic experience for me. And one of the things that was most profound because of the nature of that whole experience was my sleep. It took me about 3 years to be able to look at the bedroom the same.
Mm.
because it often provoked, images of my mom. And I woke up probably for 2 years at the same time in my sleep. I probably got about 3 to 4 hours a night for 3 years. It was very dysregulated.
Let's pause there for a moment, because I feel like one thing that we don't talk about, and that was true for me as well after my brother's death, that I moved into the guest bedroom and out of my bedroom with my husband, because I woke up every night, 2 or 3 times a night, and the crushing reality of that my brother was dead, and what that meant for everybody in my family, and the grief of my parents was too much sometimes to bear. I couldn't breathe some nights, and I would I would cry, and I would try to stifle my cries, and I didn't want to wake my husband up, so I moved into the guest bedroom. And I feel like we don't talk a lot about just grief changes us in so many ways, but for those of us where it steals our sleep, it it adds to that. Everything's awful. Everything's much worse when you don't get the sleep that you need. And when you're grieving, I always say to people, get your sleep, make sure you're hydrated, and eat food. They're
Yes.
like the three things you don't want to do, right? You're not hungry,
Right.
you
Yeah.
can't sleep,
You can't
and you're a
sleep.
mess.
Yep.
So talk to
Yep.
us about, let's talk a little bit about that, because you're a psychologist. I'm a therapist too. And I would like to spend a little bit of time for our listeners
Yeah.
who do struggle with sleep, because I do think it slows down healing, because you just
Oh,
can't sleep.
absolutely. Yeah. Well, if you sort of think about sleep and the purpose of it, it's this restorative number of hours in the day that, I believe God gives us to be able to reset, to heal physically, emotionally, spiritually, and also to sort of sink into a depth of divinity, if you will. I think that sleep is very sacred. And so to not be able to sleep, it creates so many ripple effects mentally, physically, and spiritually. So I'll share a little bit of mine. So one of the massive impacts for me was difficulty concentrating, and that's common in the face of loss in and of itself. And then when you couple that with 2 or 3 hours of sleep, and you're still sort of grinding in the workforce and taking care of your family, it just creates a situation where for me, I was on autopilot, and I was also incredibly irritable. Now, from the outside looking in, I was getting up, at the time when my mom died, I was working in academia. And so she died during our Christmas break, which was nice, if you will. I had a month off, but I went right back to work. And so I was standing before these doctoral students, absolutely miserable, sleep deprived, and still putting on the face. And it took everything in me to get up and make that happen. And as soon as I came home, I was crashing physically. And then for whatever reason, I'd hit that bedroom again when it was around the traditional time to go to sleep. And it escaped me like the plague. And there I was again, up. And then it just became a cycle for years. So it was very.
I, yeah, it's almost like you begin to fear the night, and fear the quiet, and fear and fear the times when you're in your car, like all the places when your mind is free to, what I think is, take a deep dive back into the past with your loved one, and just feel like you are dying too. Sometimes the pain is so intense. And and I know for me that I would start to dread that nighttime. I would start to dread the quiet. And so I would love for you to share with us, what did you do? Like, I mean, did you start to fear the night? And what would you do when you couldn't sleep? How did you help yourself do this? How long did it take? Because I think all of us, when we've been in the deep throes of the darkness of grief, the scariest part is it going to be like this forever? Am I always going to feel this way? And what are these small things that we can do?
Yeah. I love this question because I think that grief can be all consuming. And I won't lie, Susan, there were so many moments throughout the past 10 years that I have felt absolutely powerless to grief. And I'm grateful that I've had some wonderful therapists along the way who've reminded me that, yes, there are so many uncontrollable variables. And at the same time, there are spaces for you to exercise some control. And so after a couple of years of succumbing to the sleep issues and dreading sleep, it dawned on me, because I was dreading the bedroom. It dawned on me one day. I said, I'm looking at this as, gosh, I hate the witching hour, the 2 a.m. to 5 p.m. My mom died around between 4 and 5 a.m. And I kept waking up at that time. And I was always waking up angry that I couldn't go back to sleep, and would just sort of wrestle and talk to God and just be angry, honestly. But it dawned on me that through the help of my therapist, that time could be reframed in a way that I could draw closer to my mom and talk with her. I could talk with God in those moments. And I could also rethink traditional sleep times, which is something that I had never really thought of. I was raised, we go to bed at 9, 10, we wake up at 6, and that's the way that it is. Everybody in the world does it that way. But again, with the help of my therapist and my physician, we sort of allowed that circadian rhythm, if you will, to sort of work itself out in due time. So instead of getting up and being angry and frustrated at God and, gnashing teeth, I decided to make that 2:30 to 5 a time to pray, which naturally sort of calmed me down from the anger and the fear. And then I started to write a book. I felt this call from my mom in my ear saying, "You have something to say." And I'd always been a writer, not in a formal sense, but I'd always loved writing, and writing was always a safe haven for me. And instead of lamenting that time, I started to put pen to paper. And out of that second year, a book was born. I ended up writing a memoir about this entire experience. And they were opportunities for me to reflect on time spent with my mom.
Yeah, and you know that I mean it's why I was so intrigued by your work, because I told you I'm getting ready to finally launch my grief and my grief writing course, and knowing how powerful it is, and wrote my way through my own grief with my book. And I love that. I love the way that you took that time and did something with it that brought you some measure of comfort. Tell us about your memoir. What's the name of your book?
Yeah. So the name of the book is called Relaxing into the Pain: My Journey into Grief and Beyond, which is a title that I love.
I
And
love it too.
I can't take credit for it. I can't take credit for it, Susan. I actually, when my mom first died, I entered therapy around probably 7 or 8 months after her death, and continued in that for the next several years. And I was sitting with my therapist, and this was on the heels of her sort of seeing me actively avoid grief. I went into academia, and my work became my entire identity. I lost every sense of who I was. My social circle started to dwindle, and work became everything to me. And she realized that I had sort of taken the grief avoidance route, yet it was manifesting in these other ways: irritability, limited social interactions. My mood was really down. I was feeling depressed. And so she insightfully leaned across the room in one of my therapy sessions and said, "Mekel, you've sort of bore the weight of this grief, and by not really leaning into it, right? What would it look like if you relaxed into the pain of it all?" And I knew that needed to be the book title, because I I knew that I was actively avoiding it, and I realized the power of leaning into pain, because that's what I'd always done through writing, was lean into those pockets and those crevices in my life that were very painful and dark, and through that was always a transformative experience.
Let's talk about what it means to lean into. I know what you mean by that. And I have a couple of questions. I want to talk about what leaning into it means to you. But before we go there, you sought out therapy. Had you ever gone to therapy prior to your mother's passing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
But I will say this was the first time I did it because I knew that I needed it. I had done it before, but that was a requirement for my master's program.
same here. Right, right.
Yeah, so these were sort of like checking off boxes, like, oh yes, I know what it feels like to sit on the other side. This was the first time that I entered therapy with desperation, knowing that I needed someone to walk with me through this journey.
So here's here's my question. It sounds a bit contradictory, and I'll tell you why. So you realize through your grieving that you need help. I also went to a grief therapist myself because
Yep.
I knew I couldn't do it. I think I was 6 months in and I'm like, I can't do this by myself. However, your therapist also had insights that you were avoiding your grief. So talk to us about that, because I feel like that it sounds contradictory. We know it's not. You know you need help, and yet the very thing you need help for, you're trying to avoid because it's painful.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was this moment where your therapist, you need to lean into it. Talk to us about that
Yeah.
whole process, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Yeah, I think, when I originally came to see the therapist, I named that I was there for grief and loss. Yet the course of our therapy wasn't really ever focused on that. I was focusing on the difficulties that I was experiencing in academia as a Black woman trying to climb a corporate ladder. I was talking about the difficulty of having transplanted myself from Texas to LA and sort of how to expand my social sphere and the frustration of that. And then sort of next steps. I was at a point in my career where I was in academia, but I knew deep down that that wasn't going to be a forever thing. And so we spent months and months talking around everything else. And she would bring up, as I would express, irritability, or again, my dwindling social circle, she would bring up my mom, and I would turn off the freeway, and we're not going to go down that anymore. And honestly, after she posed this question about relaxing into the pain, I no showed appointments for about 2 months. So
Okay,
I was that person.
So yeah, right. I know, and I love this. I love when therapists talk about how we do our avoidance. So I know, because we have these brilliant insights for our clients. And then we're like, whoa, don't shine the light on me.
Mhm.
So when she talked about, I do love the language about leaning in, because I think the image is very powerful. It also is extraordinarily terrifying. And I'll never forget when I was doing my MFA, and I was in Ireland and there was a writer, and she was this amazing Irish writer. And I remember her saying, you need to cut into the nerve of your writing. And if you're not moved by your own work, no one else will be either.
Wow.
And so I'm interested to know what leaning in, what did that mean for you? What did it look like for you to lean into the pain of losing your mom?
Mm-hmm. That meant recognizing and naming the fact that my mom just wasn't my mom. And my mom was a hell of a person. Let me just say that. I hope that shines through, because she still is in my life, but she was more than my mom. She was my confidant, my boyfriend, my prayer partner, my advisor, my best friend. She represented and took up so much space in my life. And so it wasn't like one person was dying. It felt like 9 or 10 people were dying. It was a very layered experience for me. And so relaxing into the pain was, number one, sort of working through all of these ways that I sort of viewed her, and grieving that my best friend, wasn't going to be there. The person who I called every day and had these marathon phone calls wouldn't be the one to offer that sage advice anymore. And it also meant sort of being still and sitting long enough in the grief to actually feel it in my body. Because the truth was, it was manifesting in my body anyway. And that's sort of where that was the connection that my therapist made, that helped me know that I cannot outrun grief. I was experiencing headache. I had headaches for about 4 years straight, every single day, shoulder tension, of course, the sleep dysregulation. And then I would have these random moments where I could not feel my lower extremities. And it would just feel like dead weight. Like I remember trying to get out of the car one time and literally having to pick up my thigh to like throw my leg out over the car to be able to get out. And every time I would go to the doctor's office, they were like, everything's normal, everything's fine, you're fine. But everything wasn't fine. So, her making the connection between my body and the manifestations of grief was really eye opening to let me know I don't have any choice but to shine a light on this. That's what it
So
means to relax into it.
even though you strike me as the kind of woman that understands the mind body soul connection. So when this was happening to you, really, so really when you were having these, because I wrote about how I felt like I had stones in my legs, and I know that heaviness.
Oh, yeah.
You were not connecting the grief to the physical
No,
manifestation. So okay,
no.
that's fascinating.
Which is crazy. I was a psychologist at that point, and I had been in mental health for 20 years. And it's different when it's you. And I can't really wrap my mind around why that is. Well, yes, I can. Grief can sort of make you feel very myopic. And for me, it was literally, I was so focused on each moment that I couldn't even take in the greater landscape to appreciate, that sleep was making me horrible to people. I was losing friends. I wasn't really tending to my body as I had. And no, I didn't make that connection until she said that.
So how long after your mother's death did you start to feel these physical manifestations in your body, do you think, roughly speaking?
Yeah. So my mom died, and 2 days later, my dad and I were at church. And what I'll say is that my menstrual cycle, it opened up a floodgate where I literally bled for about 6 months. My body was purging a lot of different things, but I still didn't make the complete connection that it had to do with my mom's death. I think that was sort of an opening window to let me know that I needed to release. And because I wouldn't release through here, my body was releasing it in other ways. So that happened very soon after. And then the random aches and pains and sort of sensitivities that I had, that happened probably 6 to 8. I remember traveling to Hawaii in August 2013. And this is what I sort of framed in my book as this first rock bottom moment, where I'm sitting in Hawaii and feeling all these physical symptoms, feeling as if, spiritually I had been sort of abandoned, and all of these different things happening at once. And my body, it felt like I was literally in an alternative universe. Like I was floating through that whole experience in Hawaii, disconnected. Like I was physically disconnected from my person. And I don't think that I came back to myself probably till 2014.
Well, and that's what I was going to say, is that I think sometimes, I think deep grief is a complete disconnection. I think that this out of body experience is really our way of trying to survive and to digest the magnitude of this incredible loss.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, I always say the same thing. You can't outrun grief. It will come out in lots of different ways if we are not able to process the emotions. Have you ever seen, this is just sort of random, I just watched this the other night, but did you ever see the movie Cake with Jennifer Aniston?
I didn't. No.
So I feel like I must have watched it because of our conversation today, because I found it. It's an old movie. I was like,
Okay.
This looks super depressing, but for some reason I wanted to watch it. So she
I have to laugh, Susan. That's so me. That's so me. I'm drawn to the melancholy. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, probably our work. But she lost her child in this horrific accident. She had this chronic body pain, like this pain that was so severe that it was completely debilitating in all areas of her life. She had worked with the physical therapist forever. The physical therapist is like, I have no idea why your pain's not going away. It should be, yada, yada, yada. And of course, it is because she was not doing her grief work, right? And it was showing up in her body.
Absolutely.
And so, in the movie, it was one of those things where I was like, oh my God, this is such a beautiful depiction of what it feels like to grieve when we try so hard to tamp it down. And so I just appreciate that here you are, a psychologist, and you lose the person who is central to your universe on so many levels. And here it is 9 months later, you are having these physical symptoms, and you think that there is something wrong with you, right? Like you're not connecting at all to the deep grief around your mother.
Nope.
So what happens when you do make that connection? What happens when you do start leaning in to your grief with your therapist? Talk to us about sort of the transformation, or what happens.
Yeah, I think that for me, and I'll sort of give a little bit of a context. So my mom, as amazing as she was not a woman who readily walked around talking about her feelings. Both of my parents were in the Air Force. And so we were the kids on Saturday who were out riding bikes at 7 a.m. because we were up, our house was disciplined, we had our beds made, and we were doing chores. And so emotional expression was not necessarily the most welcome thing at the table. So when this connection was made between my mom's death, my emotional response, and my physical response, to be honest, it was like I was introducing myself to someone I'd never seen. I'd always lived a very controlled life in the sense of, my career and my day-to-day and the structure. And I think that's one of the reasons that, I decided early on that I wasn't going to be part of that club, because I wanted to maintain that structure that I always knew. And so to your question, I completely fell apart. It was necessary, but it was very difficult because I literally felt like God was dismantling every part of who I thought I was. And I wasn't familiar with my emotional self. I wasn't familiar with, asking for help. I wasn't familiar with my body breaking down as a former athlete. None of these things made sense. And so I definitely went through more rock bottoms after that. And thankfully, with a great therapist and the people who I had in my faith community at the time, I was able to realize that all that was my humanity showing up. I had never really seen the fullness of my humanity before that, because I never allowed myself to be all of me, if that makes sense.
What happened when you experienced your full humanity? Because I think when I think about hitting rock bottom, I used to, some of the ways I've written about it, until you kiss the bottom of that well. And once you have, there really is no going back to the facade of life or the mask or the illusions that I think we live in sometimes in this world. So talk to me about when you were able to see the reflection of your own fullness. What was that like for you?
It was scary. Partly because, and I think this is one of the reasons that people sort of get into the grief avoidance patterns, is you are in an abyss. And for someone like me who had never experienced the losing of my footing prior to my mom's death, like I did after her death, it was extremely unsettling. So that was one thing. I think the other thing was I didn't like what I saw. So growing up, I was always cast as the sensitive child, right? Like I easily cry, and that stands to be true to this day. But it's a part of me that I never cultivated. I cultivated the strong work ethic, the performance, the doing, the achieving, the success, but not so much the emotional part. So when I came to know that part, I hated it. I absolutely hated it. It's something I had associated with weakness my entire life. And a lot of this was born out of, sort of the strong Black woman trope. And, whether I liked it or not, that's a message that, my grandmother had passed to my mom, and that my mom had passed to me. Like, we just put our big girl panties on and keep going. And so to confront this very frail and fragile part of myself felt devastating. At the same time, I had never been closer to God before in my life. And I feel like even though I considered myself a faith-filled person up to that point, I don't think I had really experienced God at all before that point. And it really was in the darkness that my faith really started to grow, and I was able to plant seeds like never before and cultivate a relationship with God. So all of that was happening at once. There was excitement about the spiritual depths and a lot of devastation about who I would now become and accepting who she was.
And I think that, you're talking about the strong Black woman. And for me, where I can really relate is I am a deeply sensitive human too. I think that that is a trait a lot of us as therapists have inherently in probably what draws us to the profession to want to help people. And at the same time, it is not a trait that is revered in corporate America or academia or anywhere for that matter, right? We're told it always feels very derogatory when we're young. Oh, you wear your heart on your sleeve. It's always that characteristic is always talked about in the context of weakness, right?
That's right.
When it is such a beautiful, beautiful strength to bring into this world, to have compassion and a sense of heart.
Yes. Well, and it reminded me of, as a kid, I remember hearing, and part of this was we were a Black family in the South in a predominantly white environment, and hearing my parents say, like, you don't have time to cry. You're always going to have to rise to the top, no matter how you feel. Because if you don't, you won't be successful in a white world. So there was all of that sort of layering, this challenge that I had with reconciling that part of myself. Today, I can say that I'm so grateful that I've been able to tap into really the most beautiful part of who I am. But at the time, it was, I hate her. And I wish that, she didn't pop up at the strangest of times. And it felt embarrassing to sort of reveal that part of myself.
And so when you were able to embrace and accept this other side, which you might have considered your shadow side, right? The part that you hate, the part that you tried to keep tucked away, the part that you might pop up and you'd slap your hand on it like little meerkats, right?
Yep.
And what happened? Tell us, was there a moment? Was it more just really a process? Do you remember what it felt like when you were able to truly embrace that side of yourself that you had hated for so long?
I think that I am still growing in acceptance. I certainly can look at that part of myself and see why I was successful with certain things, because I was bringing this authenticity and this creativity without really realizing that's what it was. My writing, as I look back, I have looked back and kept journals since I was like 10. So to go back and look at how and what I wrote, it's always been me. But I think that's where it got buried, was in the journal. And so, I'm still reconciling parts. Earlier today, if I am completely transparent, I woke up, my fiance and I went to church, and on the way to church, for whatever reason, I just felt this heaviness in my soul. And I was sort of unconsolably crying, but I couldn't really pinpoint, what it was. And I don't know, like, I'll sort of navigate that later. But as I was crying, I remember thinking, even though my fiance was saying, it's okay, and whatever it is, like, just let it out, a part of me was still sort of working to push that down, partly because we're going to church and I'm going to look a mess. But the other part was like, gosh, when is this going to stop? In terms of the grief process. And the answer is it probably never will. So I'm still growing in acceptance of her and that part of who I am.
My brother, it's funny because I think, when the person that we love dies, there's a hole. People describe their grieving process going around the hole. I always think about the beauty that blooms in that space. My brother's death has brought me to human beings like you that I never would have met had he not died. See, I'll start to cry. And when I was watching he lived in Bali, and I was watching a movie the other night, and it took place in Bali, and all of a sudden I just felt myself dissolving because my husband and I had gone there. We visited him in Bali, and it just brought up all of this, like, really visceral, like I could feel myself in Bali, and my husband started talking about him and seeing his smile, and that's sort of the tender beauty of, and the grace of grief, is that, gosh, it never goes away. It just transforms in these different ways. And, I think about that acute grief where you're curled up into a ball and you want to die too. And you start, and you kind of reawaken almost like a flower where you can open back up to life, but you are still going to feel the intensity and the fragility of life and relationship. And I don't know about you, but the fear of losing more people, because you just know you want to grip life like with this white knuckled fist. And at the same time, you understand that surrendering to life is really all we can do. So with that being said, I would love to know, in the years since your mom's passing, and of course then your father dying in 2020, how has your life changed? Because I know one of the things you talked about was walking away from your corporate job. Can you talk to us about the beauty that has blossomed in that space as a result of this loss?
Yeah, I'll start with that. I think, and my dad would love this. He was sort of the adventure, risk-taking Harley Davidson driving motorcyclist. And so my dad's life was always on edge in some level. And he was the person taking flying lessons who during the lesson would, oh, let's take a quick dive. Like, he always grabbed life by the horns. And so when he died, I think one of the beautiful things that came out of it was it awakened me to the reality that I felt bound by the sort of Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. And this is not to down that. I think that there's beauty in that space as well. But I always sort of viscerally knew from the beginning of time that was not me. But that's what we do. Like, this is what society says. You get up and you go to work Monday through Friday, and you have Saturday and Sunday off. But I knew that I needed to sort of free myself from that. So one of the greatest things that came from that was I was able to leave my position and start my own practice and consulting firm. And there's been a lot of beauty with that. I've traveled around the world offering trainings around grief and loss, and able to share my own testimony. I've connected with people like you just to go deeper in connection with people who are grieving, but also be able to uplift and inspire. And then I'll say, I think it's blessed my relationship. So I'm a bit of a late bloomer. I met my fiance 4 years ago, into my 40s. And I think that waking up to, and I was going to say the softer side of me, but I won't say that. I'll say the truer side of me has really benefited my relationship. I think I was navigating relationships very differently, probably tapping into much more the masculine parts of myself than the femininity. And so being able to cry with David and being able to allow him to see that, I think has made me a much better partner. And when he struggled, I'm able to experience him with more compassion, as opposed to just get up and make it happen. Put your big boy pants on. Let's do it. And I think that's going to make for a more beautiful marriage. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really beautifully put. And I know we have already been on for an hour, which I cannot believe.
Oh gosh, it feels like we just started, Susan.
I know. So I've got a few more questions for you. I want you to talk to us. I think that what I loved so much when I jumped on your website was to see that, when I started this conversation, was your own belief in being able to write through grief and loss and really put that pen to paper. You've got to download. I downloaded it, and it's giving people writing tips and journaling about their grief and loss. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it's called the Write Where You Are, WRITE,
Which I love.
Mindful Journaling for Grief Guide. And essentially, it's an opportunity to help shine a light on the mindfulness of writing, right? I think a large part of what we do day to day is mindless. we get up, we go to work, and we're sort of on autopilot doing that. We come home, and because of the stress that we're facing, we distract ourselves, never really shining a light that relaxing into the pain of it all. And so part of the guide is to help distinguish between those two things. And this is not to say that there's not a space for mindless activity. We need that. We need to disconnect and sort of unwind, unplug. At the same time, in the grief space, I would say that it's a necessity to mindfully lean into those parts that are painful. So the guide offers just some very basic introductory prompts, and it gives the consumer just a chance to sort of think about how they might be able to more frequently embed mindful writing as a mechanism for releasing those things that have been internalized for quite some time.
And so you obviously have tested your own theory. And so you said that you wrote before. You were somebody who was into journaling prior to your mom's death. Let me ask you a question, because I'm still deeply intrigued by this idea of you having all of these physical symptoms and not connecting it to your grief. Did you stop journaling during that time? Were you shutting, what was happening with your journaling during this time after you lost your mother? And I know that your dad's departure obviously was huge too, but it sounds like life for you really tipped on its head after your mother's death.
Yeah.
So talk to us about the writing part around that. Were you doing any journaling then?
Yeah. So in my memoir, Relaxing into the Pain, it's essentially sort of a reflection back on journal entries leading up to my mom. It starts with the day that my mom died, or my mom was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And it charts the course of about a year and a half. So I was continuing to write. And again, I think, grief sort of, especially in the acute phase, is sort of very myopic. It's sort of one foot in front of the other. All you can really take in is what's happening that day. And so interestingly, is if I put these journal entries together, it paints a picture. But in the moment, and I was able to do that in 2014 as I sort of put the pieces of the puzzle together to write the memoir. But leading up to that, they were very much single entry journal writing pieces. And so I think that compartmentalization of my writing and not reflecting on the writing, which I had done before and I do now, was partly the contributor to my not piecing together all of these things. Yeah, that's the only way that I can explain that.
Yeah, well, I can't wait to sort of look at some of your prompts and dive into the journaling activities that you have available for everyone. Can you tell people where they can find you?
Absolutely. So my website is w.Mekel Harris, PhD. That's Mekel Harris, Harris, PhD.com. And there you'll find a lot about my writings. I have been doing relatively weekly blog posts for a couple of years. And so it's all related to aspects of grief and loss. And as you mentioned in the bio, just sort of how do we focus on our living, so the life part of ourselves, how do we show up, and how does grief impact our leadership? How does it affect our love? And also, how does it affect our loyalties in terms of relationships to others, ourselves, and to God? And so you'll get a taste of all of those things, as well as access to some of my courses.
Wonderful. So I told you that I don't have any canned questions, but I always end my interviews with the same question. And I think I can't wait to ask you, given what you said earlier about reconciling these two pieces of who you are, this very strong Black woman with the fragility and the compassion and the sensitivity of this other side of you. What does self-love look like for you now?
It's definitely not pedicures and manicures. This is one of my courses, actually. It's called Self-Care Reboot. And the whole idea of this is to sort of help to reimagine what self-care and self-love looks like. Not to take away from those, but self-love to me really is about how I can take steps to more fully know who I am. And so I do that through, continuing to read about what God says about me that helps fill in those gaps. I'm also an avid Enneagram. If people have heard of the Enneagram, I love that. And I do coaching around that if anyone's interested in reaching out for that. So integrating more about myself, learning more about myself, and working to fit those pieces together to create my mosaic. And there are many pieces to that. Some have yet to be discovered, but every day to try to shine a light on who I am and what do I naturally do. And that's more of how I want to show up in the world each day.
It's really beautiful. And it makes me think, when we ran bereavement groups with children at the Center for Grieving Children, and one of the exercises we would do is they would break a pot, a clay pot, and they would color it and paint it and do glitter, and they would put it back together in this beautiful mosaic design. And there were holes all through it.
Yeah.
And that beautiful saying, we all have cracks, that's how the light gets in. But for these children, the idea was that your life never looks the same after a deep loss, but it can be so beautiful, and the light can shine. The light will help to shine through these pieces of who we are and light up those dark places. And so I loved the language, the mosaic, because I think that is exactly what death and grief looks like, is putting the pieces back together again in a way that creates something different, but just as beautiful.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say for me, in certain ways, even more beautiful.
Yes, definitely.
I'll quickly share. I didn't realize, I said that my mom was like 8 or 9 people, and she, in a lot of ways, was like my God, to be honest with you. Her death sort of cracked open my faith in a way where I could finally see God, because I didn't have my mom to serve in that capacity anymore. And for that, I'm grateful. Even though I wish she were here, I know that I'm definitely more tethered to God than I ever have been. And I don't think that would have happened if she were still here, to be honest.
Cracks, like you said, it cracks our heart wide open.
Yes.
And I can't say it any better than that. That is beautifully put. I want to thank you for coming and sharing and the fragile, beautiful parts that you have come to know in yourself with all of us. And I hope everybody runs out and buys your memoir. For our listeners, we will have a link to an Enneagram if you guys are interested. I highly recommend you take it. I think that there's a free version, and then there's also a paid version. I think it's only like $12, but it's a very cool test that you guys can take to learn more about yourselves. And we'll also have a link to your website as well for people who want to find you. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to, in 2023, integrating my love of the Enneagram with grief and loss. And so I'm actually creating a course, as you are, to help people as they navigate aspects of themselves through the Enneagram, apply that understanding to how to best help themselves as they grieve. So,
okay, that's brilliant.
I'm excited about that.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you, my listeners. I love you guys. Thank you for tuning in each week. And no matter where you are in your grief and loss process, please remember to be gentle with yourselves and offer yourselves grace. Okay. Bye for now.